What if I told you that the Bible isn't just a book of truth, that it's more than that its structure, its very shape, is a part of its divine message? There's this old communications maxim, show, don't tell. And by that, they mean that oftentimes, whenever we're communicating, we want to explain something, but sometimes it's better just to show it, right? Or maybe tell a story that demonstrates the idea. What if the Bible is doing something like that? What if, in fact, it does both? Telling us something, but also showing it. Welcome to BibleCurio, where we don't just read the Bible, we uncover its hidden depths. I'm Tyler Jimerson, and in this podcast, we're going to explore the artistry, patterns, and mysteries woven into Scripture that you might never have noticed before. Today's episode is a big one. We're talking about something that might change the way you read the Bible, and that's something I like to call structural allegory. The idea that the Bible doesn't just tell us truth in its words, but it shows us truth in its very structure. That, in other words, the medium is the message. It's a bold claim, but it's not entirely new. There are thinkers and popular lecturers out there like Jordan Peterson who have said that the Bible is truer than true. And what he meant is sometimes people ask, do you think the Bible is true? And of course, he has to define, well, it depends on what do you mean by true. And his claim is that the Bible is truer than true. What does that mean? That means that the Bible is more than just factually true, that it's structurally true, that it's not simply a collection of ideas, but it's actually the progenitor of our very concept of truth itself. Even that question, the way we ask it, comes from the Bible. Like, we literally cannot conceive of reality without using the categories, the values, and structures that the Bible has already laid down. Things like justice, dignity, equity, morality, redemption, sin, grace. These are all biblical concepts. The very way we perceive reality comes from the Bible. And so it is so thoroughly permeated Western thought that even when we don't consciously acknowledge it, we are thinking within its framework. We are living, playing in the world the Bible has built. This is why Peterson argues that the Bible is truer than true, not just because it tells individual truths, but because it created the very foundation upon which we understand truth itself. It defines our moral instincts, our stories, our language, even the way we process reality. Just consider real quick, for an example, how many biblical phrases shape our everyday speech? Whether we're saying a thorn in my flesh, that comes from 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 7, or a house divided cannot stand, Mark chapter 3, or by the skin of my teeth, that's from the book of Job. Or take something as simple as the popular song Turn, Turn, Turn by the Byrds, a song that, without many realizing it, is almost verbatim from Ecclesiastes chapter 3. The Bible's language, imagery, symbols shape our world so deeply that we instinctively recognize them even if we don't know their source. But this raises a deeper question. If the Bible structures the way we think, is it possible that its own structure holds meaning too? All right, let's talk about structural allegory real quick. When I use the phrase structural allegory, I'm referring to a concept in how the Bible is designed, that allegorically a passage might convey truth in the very way that it is designed or is communicating. The idea that the Bible doesn't just communicate through words, but through the way those words are arranged. This means that when we read the Bible, we have to pay attention not to just what it says, but to kind of how it's built, because its very structure is a part of its message. Now, To give kind of an illustration of what I'm talking about, in case that's too abstract, this isn't just a biblical phenomenon. Great literature after the Bible has mimicked that very idea. Music even does this as well. I'll give you a couple examples from some of my favorite books. The first example, where the structure of a work reinforces its meaning, is my favorite book, besides the Bible, obviously, called Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the book Frankenstein, it's very deliberate in its design. It has what is called a Chinese box structure, or maybe like a Russian nesting doll, where a story is told within a story. On the outside, we have the story of Walton, who's writing this letter, and then he meets Dr. Frankenstein, Victor, who tells his story, and then it all homes in on the very middle, which is the story of the creature itself, and then it breaks back into Victor telling a story, and then finally ends with Walton again. And the reason why this structure is important is because the very nesting doll story is a picture of a womb, a life within a life. And through these multiple layers of narrative, we get a picture of what is actually missing in the story, and that's the mother figure. The creature doesn't have a mother, and that's one of the major themes of the story itself. Let's take a second example. Another favorite book of mine is by the Japanese writer Shusaku Endo, his book called Silence. And Silence is about this missionary to Japan, and the book starts off with this very egotistical missionary who's going to save the world. And so the novel starts in first person, where the main protagonist is writing these letters in first person. Eventually, as the story goes on, though, by the middle of the book, the protagonist's ego begins to dissolve, and the book shifts to a third-person narrator, someone from the outside telling the story of this protagonist. And by the very end of the book, the protagonist is just an appendix, just a footnote at the end of someone else's letter. And so it mirrors the loss of identity and ego by the end of the book. There are a lot of ways in which we tell stories, and the very way we tell it is a part of the message. Well, the Bible does this over and over and over again. It employs these structural allegories. And I want to go through a few examples with you. One of the first examples I think of is the book of Psalms. I love the Psalter. And anybody who has studied the book will notice that these 150 Psalms are arranged into 5 books. And any reader of the Psalms who is familiar with the other parts of the Bible will know immediately this reminds us of the 5 books of Moses. The point is to convey this liturgy, this poetry of worship, as, in a sense, a response to the law, maybe even mirroring the Torah itself to be like a new law of worship. Or we might think of the book of Lamentations, another Old Testament example. Lamentations is a book that is lamenting the destruction of Jerusalem and the eventual exile and bondage into Babylon. And the first 4 chapters of Lamentations are what are called acrostic poems. Now, acrostics are essentially poems where you go through each letter of the alphabet. And so these first 4 chapters, each verse begins with a successive letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Think of kind of like an A to Z structure, but in Hebrew. So Lamentations 1, 2, and 4 are carefully structured acrostics, showing that even in suffering, there's a sort of order to this story. Then Lamentations 3 is this sort of climax. It's the center of the book. It's the longest and most tense, and it is a triple acrostic pattern. But then comes Lamentations chapter 5. In the final chapter, it completely abandons the acrostic pattern, becoming chaotic, disordered, fragmented, just like the city of Jerusalem itself, where it's conveying the fact that Jerusalem is being destroyed, but it's also showing it in the way that the last chapter is designed, where it's not just about the fall of Jerusalem, but it makes you experience the very unraveling of the city by unraveling its very own structure. The final chapter breaks down into chaos, just like the world of its writer, and so the form itself is actually a part of its message. Or we think about a couple New Testament examples. The book of Matthew is a wonderful one. This is the first gospel. And Matthew, the writer, who is writing predominantly to a Jewish audience, structures his entire gospel to be reminiscent of the law. In Matthew, there are 5 main didactic speeches from Jesus as a teacher. We're thinking of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapters 5 through 7. We think about his teaching to the apostles about evangelism and missions in Matthew chapter 10. We think about his likening the kingdom in parables in Matthew chapter 13. We think about his instructions for the church in Matthew 18. And then we think about his lament and his lambasting of the temple structure and the Pharisees in Matthew 23 through 25. We have 5 speeches that are meant to echo the law and bits of narrative interspersed throughout that. And why? Why this design? Because Matthew is laboring to present Jesus as the new Moses. And so how appropriate to organize his 5 speeches after the manner of the law. Another example, just one more from the Gospels. This is the Gospel of John now. John is laboring to present his story of Jesus through the lens of Genesis. John doesn't just begin his entire book with the echo in the beginning as a poetic callback, but actually his entire gospel is structured like the creation week, like Genesis 1 and 2, leading to a new creation. For example, John is the only one who talks about Jesus' miracles as signs. And how many signs does Jesus have? He has 7 signs that are meant to echo the 7 days of creation. On the 6th day, for example, Jesus is presented as the man. Whenever Pilate regales him and holds him out to the crowd to be crucified, it's on the 6th day where he says, "Behold the man," which is meant to echo the creation of Adam. Why is it that only in John's gospel is the place where Jesus buried referred to as a garden, and he's mistaken for a gardener? All hearkening back to the Garden of Eden. Why is it Jesus rests in the tomb on the Sabbath day, but then he raises again on the first day of the week to mark out this new creation week, the beginning of a new week? It's designed very deliberately to convey truth even in its structure. Each of these isn't just a literary technique. It's proof of divine craftsmanship. The way the Bible is built mirrors the truth it teaches. So, think about the universe. Stars arranged in constellations, galaxies and spirals, and the fine-tuned precision of the cosmos. Every force, every fundamental law balanced on a razor's edge to allow life to exist. If God structures the universe with such precision, would he not structure his word in the same way? The Bible doesn't just tell the truth. It is fine-tuned down to its patterns, its rhythm, its very shape. The same intelligence that designed the cosmos also designed Scripture itself. So that's my encouragement for you today is next time you open the Bible, don't just read it. Look at its design, because its very structure is whispering something to us. If you enjoyed this episode of BibleCurio, be sure to subscribe for more explorations into the hidden depths of Scripture. Until next time, keep seeking, keep wondering, and keep reading beneath the surface.